November 1943. The Italian countryside was locked in a bone-chilling freeze, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and never lets go. In the shadowy valley near the Moro River, American GIs weren't the only ones fighting for every inch of ground. On the other side, German soldiers huddled in battered farmhouses, clutching their rifles, eyes darting to every window and crack in the wall. But what haunted them wasn't the roar of artillery or the rattle of machine guns. It was something far more terrifying, an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight back against. It started with a single shot at dawn. A German soldier, just lighting a cigarette, dropped dead before the match even touched the tip. No warning, no echoing gunfire, just a sudden, silent end. 3 hours later, another man fell, this time while carrying ammunition across what should have been safe ground, hundreds of yards from the front lines. By midday, a third, an old veteran who'd survived the hell of Stalingrad, was killed while peering through binoculars, the bullet shattering glass and bone in a single surgical strike. Each death was a message, written in blood and fear. Nowhere was safe. Inside the farmhouse, panic spread like wildfire. 12 men, battle-hardened and armed to the teeth, now cowered in the basement, their weapons useless against a phantom. The youngest, barely 18, whispered a single word over and over: witchcraft. Even their captain, a veteran since the invasion of Poland, couldn't explain what was happening. He'd heard every sound war could make, but this was different. This was something new, something that broke every rule of combat. Rumors began to swirl among the German ranks. Some said the Americans had developed a new kind of weapon, a rifle that could shoot through fog and stone. Others whispered about invisible bullets or snipers who could see through walls. The most superstitious believed it was black magic, a curse brought down from the frozen forests of North America. Fear took root, growing stronger with every unexplained death. Soldiers refused to move, refused to look out windows, refused to even light a cigarette. The valley became a graveyard of nerves, every shadow a potential threat. But across the valley, hidden among dead grapevines and frostbitten rocks, the real story was unfolding. The unseen killer wasn't a ghost or a demon. He was a man, one with patience honed by years of hunting in the wilds of North America, a man who understood that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield wasn't firepower or technology. It was fear. And as the fog rolled in, thick and silent, that fear became a weapon sharper than any bullet. What the Germans didn't know was that this new kind of warfare was just beginning. And the legend of the invisible sniper, the ghost in the fog, would soon spread far beyond the hills of Italy, changing the way armies fought and the way soldiers survived forever. Long before he became a name whispered in terror across the battlefields of Europe, Harold Marshall was just another face in the crowd, a quiet, rugged man from the endless wilds of Manitoba, North America. To most American soldiers, the Canadian wilderness was a place of legend, a frozen frontier where only the toughest survived. For Marshall, it was home. He grew up tracking wolves through snow so deep it swallowed your boots, learning to move without a sound, to wait for hours in the biting cold, and to strike only when the moment was perfect. In a world obsessed with speed and firepower, Marshall's greatest weapon was patience. When the war broke out, Marshall didn't fit the mold of a typical soldier. He wasn't a career military man. He couldn't march in perfect formation, and he didn't care much for rules or ceremony. Other sergeants joked about the Indian guide from the north, even though Marshall was as white as the snow he'd grown up in. But what set him apart wasn't his background, it was his eyes. He saw things others missed. The way wind bent the grass, the faintest movement in the trees, the subtle shift of light on a distant hill. He could disappear into the landscape, becoming invisible even in plain sight. The Canadian Army, like its American allies, was still figuring out how to use snipers. Most commanders saw them as scouts or lucky marksmen, not as a real threat to the enemy. But Marshall had a different vision. He believed that a single, perfectly placed shot could do more damage than 100 bullets sprayed in panic. He knew that fear was a force multiplier, and that the right kind of fear could paralyze an entire enemy unit. When he first suggested using snipers as a weapon of terror, his ideas were dismissed as fantasy. Why waste a good soldier on single targets when you could unleash artillery and wipe out dozens at once? But Marshall was relentless. He argued that noise and chaos only made the enemy more determined. A sniper, on the other hand, was a ghost, a silent killer who struck without warning and vanished before anyone could react. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to haunt the enemy's dreams, to make them afraid of every open window, every patch of fog, every moment of calm. It was a new kind of warfare, one that relied on nerves of steel and the kind of patience that could only be learned in the wild. Eventually, someone in command listened. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, a man known for thinking outside the box, gave Marshall the green light to build his own sniper section. Marshall handpicked his team: hunters, trappers, and farm boys who understood the value of waiting. He trained them to read the land like a map, to blend into any environment, and to shoot only when absolutely certain. He taught them that every bullet counted, that every shot was a message, and that their real mission wasn't just to kill, it was to create fear. Marshall's approach was revolutionary, and it didn't take long for results to show. His team became legends among Allied forces, their exploits spreading through American and Canadian ranks alike. Stories of impossible shots and invisible killers made their way into mess halls and foxholes, inspiring awe and envy in equal measure. For the first time, the enemy wasn't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting shadows, ghosts from the frozen north who seemed to know every secret of the land. As the war raged on, Marshall's methods would change the face of combat forever. But at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Sometimes, the deadliest weapon isn't the biggest gun or the loudest explosion. Sometimes, it's the quiet man who knows how to wait, who knows how to disappear, and who never misses when it matters most. In the chaos of World War II, armies on both sides were desperate for any edge that could turn the tide. For the Allies, every inch of ground in Italy came at a staggering cost. Traditional tactics, massive artillery barrages, waves of infantry, and relentless machine gun fire were grinding down both men and morale. American commanders watched as their own troops struggled to break through German defenses, realizing that brute force alone wasn't enough. Something had to change, and fast. That's when the Canadian experiment caught the attention of Allied brass. Word spread quickly through American command posts. A handful of Canadian snipers were doing what entire battalions couldn't: breaking the enemy will to fight. The secret wasn't new technology or overwhelming firepower. It was a radical new doctrine built on patience, precision, and psychological warfare. At the center of it all was Harold Marshall, the quiet hunter from the north, now leading a team of men who could turn fear itself into a weapon. Marshall's approach was unlike anything the U.S. Army had seen. Instead of treating snipers as glorified scouts, he built specialized sections dedicated to long-range, high-impact shooting. These weren't just sharpshooters. They were psychological operators, trained to exploit every weakness in the enemy's mindset. Marshall handpicked his men, searching for those with nerves of steel and the ability to wait for hours, even days, without moving. He didn't want soldiers who craved action. He wanted hunters who understood that the best shot was the one you never had to take twice. The equipment was just as important as the training. While most Allied troops carried the reliable Lee Enfield or the American M1 Garand, Marshall's snipers used modified Ross rifles, an old Canadian design, infamous for jamming in the trenches of World War I but unmatched in accuracy at extreme distances. Marshall personally tuned each rifle, adjusting the trigger pull, hand-loading ammunition, and mounting custom scopes. Every detail mattered. In the world of sniping, a fraction of an inch could mean the difference between life and death. But the real innovation was in the mindset. Marshall drilled his team on the science of shooting: windage, elevation, humidity, and even the way fog moved through a valley. He kept meticulous records, turning every shot into a lesson for the next. This wasn't guesswork. It was a blend of hunting instinct and cold, hard math. American officers who visited the Canadian sniper school were stunned by the level of detail. It was a far cry from the spray and pray tactics that dominated most firefights. The results were impossible to ignore. German units facing Canadian snipers began to crack. Officers refused to show themselves, patrols stopped venturing out, and entire sectors ground to a halt. The psychological impact rippled across the front lines, and American commanders took notice. Reports filtered back to Washington. The Canadians had found a way to make every German soldier feel hunted, even in their own trenches. It didn't take long for the U.S. Army to start adapting these lessons. American snipers began receiving specialized training, learning to blend patience with precision. The idea that a single, well-placed shot could change the course of a battle was no longer a fantasy. It was a proven fact. Marshall's doctrine spread like wildfire, reshaping the way Allied forces approached the enemy. In the end, the birth of the sniper doctrine wasn't just a Canadian victory. It was a turning point for the entire Allied war effort. It proved that innovation, not just firepower, could win battles. And it set the stage for a new era of warfare, where the quietest men on the battlefield could have the loudest impact. The true genius of the Canadian sniper doctrine wasn't just in the rifles or the training. It was in the way it weaponized fear itself. For American soldiers and commanders watching from the sidelines, the transformation on the battlefield was nothing short of astonishing. The Germans, once so confident in their fortified positions, were now paralyzed by an invisible threat. It wasn't the thunder of artillery or the roar of tanks that broke their spirit. It was the silent, surgical strike of a single bullet, fired from a place they could never find. Harold Marshall drilled his men in a philosophy that would soon become legendary. One shot, then vanish. Never fire twice from the same spot. Never give the enemy a chance to pinpoint your location. Every shot was a ghostly message. Death could come from anywhere at any time, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. This wasn't just about killing enemy soldiers. It was about breaking their will to fight, making them question every shadow, every patch of fog, every moment of calm. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers began to see snipers everywhere, even when none were present. They fired at empty windows, wasted ammunition on suspicious bushes, and reported phantom shooters that didn't exist. Officers refused to use binoculars near windows, terrified that a single glint of glass would give them away. Patrols stopped venturing out unless absolutely necessary, and even then, men volunteered only with the greatest reluctance. The fear was contagious, spreading through the ranks like wildfire. American intelligence officers took notice. Reports from the front lines described entire German units refusing to move during the morning fog, convinced that death was lurking just beyond their sight. Diaries recovered from captured soldiers told stories of bullets that seemed to curve around corners, of comrades dropping dead without warning, of a valley haunted by ghosts with supernatural aim. Some even whispered that the Canadians had discovered a new kind of magic, a secret weapon that defied the laws of physics. But the truth was even more chilling. There was no magic, no secret technology, just relentless discipline and a mastery of the environment. Marshall's snipers became part of the landscape, blending into the earth until they were nothing more than a rumor, a nightmare that kept the enemy awake at night. They studied wind patterns, memorized the terrain, and waited for hours, sometimes days, for the perfect shot. When it came, it was always sudden, always final, and always left the survivors questioning reality itself. The effect rippled far beyond the battlefield. American commanders saw firsthand how a handful of snipers could control entire sectors, forcing the enemy to change tactics, slow their advances, and second-guess every move. It was a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on brute strength but on the power of the mind. The lesson was clear. Fear, when harnessed correctly, was the most powerful weapon of all. As the legend of the Canadian snipers grew, so did their influence. American units began to adopt similar tactics, training their own marksmen to think like hunters, not just shooters. The doctrine of patience, precision, and psychological warfare spread through the ranks, changing the way battles were fought from Italy to the beaches of Normandy. The message was simple but profound. Sometimes, the quietest shot echoes the loudest. And for the men who faced that invisible threat, the war would never feel the same again. In December 1943, the ancient Italian town of Ortona became the stage for one of the most intense urban battles of World War II. American and Canadian troops knew the name well. Ortona was called Little Stalingrad for a reason. Its narrow streets and stone buildings turned every block into a fortress, every window into a potential death trap. For the German defenders, it was supposed to be an unbreakable stronghold. But what happened next would rewrite the rules of urban combat and send shockwaves through military circles from Washington to Ottawa. At the heart of this chaos, 3 Canadian snipers took up position in a church bell tower overlooking the main square. Their names would soon become legend, whispered in both Allied and enemy ranks. For 16 relentless hours, these 3 men controlled the entire battlefield, not with tanks or artillery, but with patience, precision, and nerves of steel. Every German soldier who tried to cross the square fell before he made it halfway. Officers who dared to peek out a window were met with instant, silent death. The Germans couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, and couldn't even risk sending a runner for help. The town was held hostage by 3 invisible hunters. American observers on the ground couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here was proof that a handful of well-trained snipers could paralyze an entire enemy force. The usual rules of war, overwhelming firepower, massed assaults, suddenly seemed outdated. Instead, the battle turned into a psychological siege. German soldiers began to talk about the ghost in the tower, a phantom shooter who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. Some claimed the Canadians had invented a new kind of bullet, one that could bend around corners or pass through solid stone. Others whispered about secret Allied technology or even black magic brought from the wilds of North America. Captured German officers later confessed that their men refused to leave their buildings, paralyzed by the fear of unseen death. Diaries recovered after the battle told of sleepless nights, of soldiers flinching at every shadow, of a terror that no amount of courage could overcome. The myth of the Canadian sniper grew with every retelling, spreading through German ranks like wildfire. Some believed the Allies had found a way to make their shooters invisible. Others insisted it was witchcraft, a curse that turned the fog and darkness into weapons. But for the Americans watching from the front lines, the lesson was clear. The battlefield had changed forever. The Battle of Ortona proved that a small, elite team could dominate a city, disrupt enemy plans, and turn the tide of an entire campaign. It wasn't just about body counts. It was about control, about making the enemy afraid to move, to fight, even to breathe. The psychological grip of the sniper was stronger than any wall or barricade. As news of the Ortona snipers spread, American commanders took notice. The U.S. Army began to rethink its own approach to urban warfare, studying the Canadian methods and adapting them for future battles. The idea that 3 men could hold an entire town hostage with nothing but patience and precision became a blueprint for special operations and urban tactics for decades to come. In the end, the Battle of Ortona wasn't just a victory for the Allies. It was a turning point in the history of warfare. It showed that sometimes, the most powerful force on the battlefield isn't the biggest gun or the largest army. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady hand of a sniper, waiting in the shadows, ready to change the course of history with a single, perfect shot. For American military strategists, numbers have always told the real story of war. And when Allied intelligence officers started crunching the data from the Italian front, what they found was nothing short of astonishing. In sectors where American and British troops faced the enemy, German officer casualties hovered around 12 to 15%, a grim but expected figure in the chaos of battle. But in the sectors held by Canadian forces, the numbers spiked to a jaw-dropping 38%. It was an anomaly that couldn't be explained by luck or coincidence. Something extraordinary was happening, and it was rewriting the rules of engagement. The secret, as American analysts soon realized, was the sniper doctrine pioneered by Harold Marshall and his team. These weren't just marksmen, they were psychological warriors, targeting not just the body but the mind of the enemy. German officers, the backbone of battlefield leadership, became the primary targets. Every time a lieutenant or captain was dropped by an unseen bullet, the entire chain of command was thrown into chaos. Orders went undelivered, patrols stalled, and discipline began to unravel. The effect was so profound that German intelligence started issuing warnings about Canadian ghost shooters, urging their own troops to avoid exposure at all costs. The psychological fallout was immediate and devastating. German soldiers who transferred into Canadian sectors quickly adopted new habits, never standing upright, even in supposedly safe areas, refusing to use binoculars near windows, wearing helmets at all times, even while sleeping. Patrol frequencies dropped by more than half, and some units flat-out refused to send men into the open unless directly ordered by their superiors. The fear was so deep that it became a kind of infection, spreading from one soldier to the next, until entire companies were paralyzed by the thought of a single, invisible enemy. American interrogators, debriefing captured German soldiers, heard stories that bordered on the unbelievable. One private, taken near Casino, described how his squad was pinned down for 2 days by a Canadian sniper they never saw. The shooter killed their sergeant through a window barely a foot wide, then picked off another man who tried to reach the radio. The survivors swore the bullets could curve around stone walls, that the Canadians had some kind of supernatural weapon. It was fear talking, but it was a fear that changed everything. The impact wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. With German units in Canadian sectors refusing to patrol, gather intelligence, or even move during daylight, the Allies gained a critical advantage. American commanders saw firsthand how the sniper doctrine could shape the battlefield, forcing the enemy to fight on terms they didn't understand. The myth of the Canadian sniper became a force multiplier, amplifying the effect of every shot and every rumor. For the U.S. Army, these lessons were invaluable. Reports from the front lines made their way back to Washington, where military planners began to rethink their own approach to sniping and psychological warfare. The idea that a handful of elite marksmen could disrupt entire enemy formations, simply by making them afraid to move, was a revelation. It wasn't just about body counts. It was about control, about shaping the enemy's behavior before a single shot was fired. In the end, the numbers didn't just tell a story. They revealed a revolution in modern warfare. The Canadian sniper doctrine, born in the frozen wilds of North America and perfected on the battlefields of Italy, had changed the game forever. And for American soldiers and commanders, it was a lesson they would never forget. As the legend of the Canadian sniper spread across the front lines, the Germans knew they had to respond. The psychological grip these invisible hunters held over entire sectors was too powerful to ignore. German high command began deploying their own elite marksmen, veterans from the brutal Eastern Front, men who had survived the frozen forests of Russia and the chaos of Stalingrad. They arrived in Italy with the best rifles, top-tier optics, and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. The stage was set for a new kind of duel. Sniper versus sniper, patience against patience, nerves of steel tested to the breaking point. But the Canadians and their American allies watching closely had a secret weapon that couldn't be matched by equipment alone. It was the doctrine of absolute patience, the willingness to wait for hours, even days, for the perfect shot. German snipers, trained to take multiple shots and keep pressure on enemy positions, often revealed themselves too soon. They fired to prove their presence, to rack up numbers, to satisfy commanders demanding results. But every shot risked exposure, and exposure meant death. Canadian snipers, by contrast, could lie motionless in mud or rubble, blending into the landscape until they became part of it. They struck only when the odds were perfect, then vanished before the enemy could react. American observers were fascinated by this new breed of warfare. Reports from the field described how Canadian sniper teams could control entire roads, crossroads, and supply lines with just a handful of shots. German units learned to move only at night, hugging the shadows, terrified of the daylight that might reveal them to the unseen eyes watching from afar. The myth grew with every engagement. Stories circulated among American GIs about Canadian snipers who could shoot through walls, who could see in total darkness, who seemed to know exactly where every enemy soldier was hiding. One name that echoed through the ranks was Corporal James Wallace, a farm boy from Saskatchewan with a reputation for impossible shots. In June 1944, near the village of Norbissa, Wallace spotted a German artillery observer working from a church steeple nearly 900 yards away. The opening was barely wide enough for a man to see through, and the wind shifted every few minutes. Wallace waited, motionless, for 40 minutes. When the observer finally appeared, Wallace fired a single shot. The bullet arced through the shifting air, slipped through the narrow gap, and struck the target dead center. German records later described the shot as impossible, but for Wallace and his fellow snipers, it was just another day at work. The Germans tried everything to counter this new threat. They built elaborate sniper nests with multiple escape routes, deployed decoys, and even spread their own rumors about Allied superweapons. But nothing could match the discipline and patience of the Canadian doctrine. German snipers, pressured to deliver results, often became the hunted instead of the hunters. Many didn't survive their first week on the Western Front. For American military planners, the lessons were clear. The sniper war wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about psychology, discipline, and the ability to shape the enemy's behavior. The U.S. Army began to adapt, sending officers to study Canadian techniques, incorporating patience and stealth into their own sniper schools. The idea that a single, well-trained marksman could control the tempo of battle, disrupt enemy plans, and create legends that lived long after the shooting stopped became a cornerstone of American special operations doctrine. In the end, the sniper war was more than a contest of skill. It was a battle for the mind. And in that arena, the Canadians, with their roots in the wilds of North America and their relentless pursuit of perfection, set a standard that would inspire American forces for generations to come. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world was forever changed. But for American military leaders, the lessons of the Canadian sniper doctrine were just beginning to take root. The stories of invisible hunters, of single shots that could halt entire battalions, became required reading in war colleges and special operations schools across the United States. What started as a desperate experiment in the frozen hills of Italy had become a blueprint for a new era of warfare, one where patience, precision, and psychological dominance mattered more than brute force. After the war, American officers were quick to seek out the secrets behind the Canadian success. They pored over captured German intelligence reports, which described the ghost shooters who haunted the front lines and shattered enemy morale. They interviewed Canadian veterans, eager to understand how a handful of men could wield such outsized influence on the battlefield. The answer was both simple and profound. It wasn't about technology or firepower. It was about mastering the human element, turning fear into a weapon and discipline into an art form. The U.S. Army wasted no time in adapting these lessons. Sniper schools sprang up across the country, from Fort Benning to Camp Perry, teaching a new generation of American marksmen the doctrine of patience and precision. The one-shot, one-kill philosophy became the gold standard, replacing outdated ideas about volume of fire and aggressive assaults. American snipers learned to blend into their surroundings, to wait for hours without moving, and to strike only when the moment was perfect. The psychological warfare pioneered by Harold Marshall and his team became a core part of U.S. Special Operations training, shaping the tactics of elite units from Vietnam to Afghanistan. But the legacy of the Canadian snipers went beyond tactics and training. They proved that the most powerful weapon on the battlefield wasn't a machine gun or a tank. It was the mind of a single, determined soldier. Their story inspired generations of American warriors, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East. The myth of the invisible sniper, the ghost in the fog, became a symbol of what was possible when skill, patience, and courage came together in perfect harmony. Even today, the echoes of that legacy can be seen in every American sniper team deployed around the world. The meticulous attention to detail, the relentless pursuit of perfection, the understanding that sometimes the quietest shot can have the loudest impact. All of it traces back to those cold mornings in Italy, when a handful of men changed the course of history with nothing but a rifle and a willingness to wait. For the U.S. military, the Canadian sniper doctrine was more than just a tactical innovation. It was a revolution in the way wars are fought and won. It taught American commanders that fear could be engineered, that morale could be shattered without a single explosion, and that the battlefield belonged to those who mastered the art of patience. In a world obsessed with technology and firepower, the story of the Canadian snipers is a reminder that sometimes the oldest skills are still the most effective. As American forces continue to adapt and evolve, the lessons of the past remain as relevant as ever. The legacy of fear, precision, and psychological warfare lives on, not just in history books, but in the hearts and minds of every U.S. soldier who picks up a rifle and prepares to wait for that one perfect shot.